we go. So today I'm so excited to welcome Hillary. As you all know, I'm Irini, or if you've been here before, which I believe most of you have, I'm Irini Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to provide free resources and support to teachers and learners of ancient texts. In addition to hour-long seminars like this one, we run 12-week courses on the Iliad in the fall and the Odyssey in the spring, and we continue to develop new courses by request. So please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions or requests. I'm going to put my email and website in the chat, and I'm going to give you one other link in the chat related to our guest today, Hillary. So happy to have Hillary join us again. Hillary's studying classics at Durham University. She's been studying Latin for the past 6 years and has just started learning ancient Greek. You can find Hillary's translation of one of Cicero's philosophical works on ancient exchanges, and I will put a link to that in the chat. You can also find Hillary's artwork for sale in the Institute's shop. So I will throw a link in there as well. And now I will turn it over to Hillary. Thank you, Hillary.
Everybody, I'm very happy to be here. Just give me a second to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see it?
Yes.
I'll take that as no problem. All right. So today we're looking at the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice in Virgil and Ovid. I was thinking about this myth a lot recently because I like Hadestown a lot. And I was wondering, what about the myth? What about the core of the myth sticks in different adaptations? Because this myth has been adapted so many times in so many different ways. Some of the first operas that we know of, in modern opera that we know of, was based on Orpheus and Eurydice. And in more recent years, we've had musicals like Hadestown and adaptations in comics like in Sandman. And this brings the question, what's the real myth, which is what I often see online? And I think that's a complicated question because arguably there's no canon. And I think that myths have always been fluid. So today we'll be looking at two ancient sources and how both poets cover it. First, we'll be looking at Virgil, who was alive from 70 to 19 BCE. And we have 3 of his works that are still extant. We have the Eclogues and Georgics, which were pastoral poems, and the Aeneid. His life is pretty much characterized by political chaos. He was 26 years old when Julius Caesar was killed during the Ides of March, and 39 by the time Actium happened. So everything was in flux. There was no stable period during his life, and that permeates in his works. We're also looking at Ovid, who was a little bit later than Virgil, and it's important to note that he's writing very much in the shadow of Virgil, because after Virgil wrote, he became emblematic of the Augustan artistic program. There's graffiti all over the place of Arma Virumque Canon in Pompeii that we found, and even in mosaics, there are often depictions of Virgil amongst the muses, like this one. So when Ovid's writing the epics, it's very much, people are very much going to compare him to Virgil. We still have a lot of his works that are still extant. Unfortunately, we've lost his Medea, which Quintilian says is the Ovidian work to read, and which is such a shame. And he died in exile for reasons that are still unknown. For the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, both poets cover it in one of their works. In Virgil, he covers it in the Georgics, which is a didactic poem on agriculture, and known to some as Virgil's best work, the best work by the best poet, as one scholar puts it. It's a poem in 4 books, and we'll be looking at pretty much the very end of it, from lines 443 to 527. Ovid covers it in the Metamorphoses, which is an epic poem on transformation, or rather how gods interfere in the lives of men. The poem has 14 books. We're focusing on the beginning of book 10 and the beginning of book 11. So let's get started and look at Virgil. To just contextualize the passage we're looking at, This is a story within a story. Aristeus, the hero of the Georgics, seeks divine counsel after he loses bees and goes on a quest, finds Proteus, and asks how he can recover his bees. Proteus then explains that he is the cause of Eurydice's death when he was chasing after her, and that Orpheus is pretty much seeking revenge. Virgil covers it in about 60-ish lines. Please don't check my maths. And we can very much look at it as a framework. He doesn't go into as much detail, but this is a very, very nicely written segment. And if we get started, for context, I've taken the translation from the Classical Library. There are certain bits that it sticks very closely to the Latin, but there are the occasional bits I'll point out. So here we talk about Eurydice's death. The Latin is very nice. In line 459, the alta and herba are separated, which means tall grass, in something called hyperbaton. And this gives you the emphasis of the hidden snake, because tall grass. Eurydice dies because of a snake as she's walking, and pretty much mourned by everybody, with this massive list from 60 to 63. But Orpheus himself takes it much, much further. Virgil emphasizes this by using the vocative to address Eurydice directly. And what's interesting is Virgil characterizes Orpheus as a character who takes everything to the excess. This becomes clear a bit later, but something to bear in mind for now. So Orpheus mourns, and then because of this, passes down into the underworld. Moving on to inside the underworld, he sings, and his song has a massive impact. If you like the Aeneid, you'll find certain lines here really, really familiar. Line 475 to 77 are pretty much directly taken from the Aeneid Book 6. And he even has a bird epic simile with the birds that are taking shelter amongst the leaves. In Book 6 of the Aeneid, it's birds that migrate to summery lands during the winter, and leaves falling from the trees during fall. So it's just very interesting how you can see Virgil develop the same ideas in a later text. So he sings and brings the all underworld to a halt, with the House of Death being spellbound, the Furies stopping, Cerberus forgetting to bark, and Ixen's wheels stopping. At this point, we get the very Virgilian theme of madness. As Orpheus is going back up, we have Dementia in 488, where he is suddenly losing purpose. His flaw, as Virgil portrays it, is a loss of control. You'll notice victus immemor victus animi, which in English is translated here as vanquished in purpose, which needs him to look back. And the final line here is effusus labor aquae imitis ruta tyranni fodera, terque flagos stagnis auditus avernis. And you just get this moment where you suddenly hear thunder 3 times in the pools of Avernus. One thing I found really fascinating is that Virgil gives Eurydice a voice, and she scolds Orpheus, directly saying that he's suffering from madness. The explicit use of furor, which is Orpheus's flaw here, and a major theme in the Aeneid, as furor is what brings Dido down and is a major, major contention in the Aeneid between furos and pietas. Another really pretty part of this passage is Queu fumus in auras commixtus tenuis, which is rather similar to Creus's farewell in Book 2 of the Aeneid, when she's described as a dream that Aeneas tries to hug. After she goes, Orpheus tries again, but fails. This happens in Ovid as well. After that, he sings for seven straight months, and he's compared to a bird mourning the loss of her chicks. One interesting thing to note here is Orpheus's connection with nature. It reinforces his supernatural status, as Virgil portrays Orpheus as a god, and his connection with nature becomes even more significant with Ovid later. The Maenads are said to react to Orpheus's devotion to his wife, as he refuses to think of love or wedding song and just goes mourning his wife. The Ciconian women, the Maenads, come, and in the middle of the rites, they tear him from bit to bit and throw him across the plains. Orpheus's dismemberment is emphasized in the Latin by the separated latos and agros, which is far spread in plains. You'll notice in 522, you've got that big separation, which I think is absolutely lovely. So after Orpheus dies, his devotion to Eurydice is emphasized yet again, as the last word that he speaks is lamenting his wife, which shows his just total devotion. And just to wrap up this segment, after this happens, Proteus explains to Aristeas how he can atone for his mistake by making a lot of sacrifices. The whole Georgics wraps up with Aristeas getting his bees back after he successfully completes the sacrifice scene. So that was Virgil. As you've noticed, it's quite short and sweet, and it touches on a couple main themes. Orpheus is mad. He takes his devotion to his wife to an entirely different level, which leads to him encountering trouble. It leads to the madness that makes him turn around, and his continued devotion and inability to move on leads to the Maenads taking offense and going after him. It's also important to note his connection to nature and his refusal to love another person. So moving on to Ovid, his Metamorphosis was published around 8 AD. For context, Virgil's Georgics was around 29 BC, and then the Aeneid was around 19 BC. And this has very heavy Virgilian influences. The story is told in several different chunks, but I'm focusing specifically on the beginning of 10 and 11 because that's the main narrative of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Because the rest of 10 is told as what Orpheus is singing to his audience, and I thought that would take way too long. There are some scholars who consider Ovid's version inferior to Virgil, and well, because of how strongly Virgil weighed on the cultural landscape, there's always going to be comparison, and as a result, Ovid deals with extra scrutiny. His Ovid is rather different to Virgil because Ovid is less critical of Orpheus, and Ovid in some places appears to directly question Virgil. So let's get started. Afu Quidem. So he was present refers to Hymen. I've cut the first 4 lines. And what's interesting is that Ovid fleshes out the timeline more than Virgil, who can be a bit vague. This is a wedding that was doomed from the start, and Eurydice dies at a more critical moment. In line 10, Orchide starting it, Orchide coming at the beginning is a bit surprising, so it gives us an element of shock in the same way Orpheus would have experienced it. So again, there's a wedding, she dies while with some other naiads. This time, Ovid doesn't go into the mourning of everyone else, but shows that Orpheus mourned her to the full to begin with, and then decided that he might go into the underworld. So he goes down into the underworld and actually sings. So here Ovid goes into significant, so he does the full song, whereas Virgil sort of skips over it. And I really like this. The most striking line to me is 23, causa vi est conjux, which is very simple language, very direct. This contrasts with the rather verbose start, where he does the proper address to the gods and explains that he isn't there to be like the other heroes who have gone down to the underworld for purposes of glory or for just joy, but he's there to simply get his wife back. He acknowledges fully that he is overcome by love, wiki amor in 26, and he begs the gods to just give him a couple extra years. This is rhetorically a really nice speech, and in my opinion, one of the better places in the Metamorphoses, and one that I read quite often. So similar to Virgil, his song has a major influence on the underworld. And he goes into more detail as to what happened. Instead of just freezing, Ixen's wheel stops, as mentioned. Tantalus doesn't make a further attempt. Vultures don't go after Prometheus. And the Belides, the ones who murdered their husbands and have to put water into urns with holes. And Sisyphus manages to take a bit of a break. What's interesting here is Ovid nodding to other versions of the myth. Because as Fama est Carmine, right, as told in other traditions, the Eumenides actually cry, and the queen and Hades cannot refuse the supplicant. So they call back Eurydice, who is still amongst new shades, and she comes limping. And line 49 really sells this with the elisions. So interret incessit passu de vulnera tardo. If you don't have experience with scansion before, elisions happen when certain syllables get dropped in order to fit the meter. So interret would be turned into interret, tincessit, and you'll notice that there's more of a rhythm there, and it does evoke the idea of limping. So, of course, Orpheus tries his best, but he looks back. I repeat in line, wait, why am I suddenly losing a number? So as he looks back, I repeat in 59, has rather violent connotations, which shows Orpheus's desperation for his wife. And what's next is another really lovely part, and where he seems to directly challenge Virgil on Orpheus's motivation. Because Eurydice doesn't suddenly start scolding Orpheus, but she makes no complaint. And Virgil adds in brackets, quid enim nisi se queretur amatum. Because how could she complain except for that she was loved? And that's really quite lovely. So Orpheus is stunned by what happened. And with the simile here, he seems to fully at this point understand what death means. So he tries again to go to the underworld, and he fails. The keeper, Charon, doesn't allow him across the river. He just doesn't get the second chance. So for 7 days, he ends up sitting on the bank, mourning, complaining that the gods are cruel. He went pretty much to phrase. So what's interesting here is that Ovid adds the extra detail that he lingers, whereas Virgil seems to say that he goes, says no, and then leaves. Ovid adding this extra detail shows Orpheus's doggedness at trying to find his wife, and is more sympathetic in that he really does try. At this point, he sings again. He sings for 3 years, and he shuns all love of womankind, and instead turns to giving his love to tender boys. This is interesting because he becomes a slightly early model of pederasty. If you're interested in reading more about this, there's an article that I have put in the notes at the very end. And this is where he differs from Virgil, because Virgil suggests that Orpheus becomes celibate after the shock of losing his wife, whereas Ovid suggests that he doesn't abstain, but spurns the love of women specifically. This also changes the motivation for the Ciconian women in Book 11. So he stays in Thrace and sings until the Maenads come and seize him. And as I mentioned just now, they are upset because they believe that Orpheus is scorning them, as in women. What follows here is an interesting segment, which is very much like a battle scene. So we find a lot of martial imagery and we find a lot of natural imagery. Moving on, Orpheus doesn't fight back in a conventional sense throughout this bit, but tries singing. As Ovid mentions later, it is the only power he has, and it hasn't failed him yet. So Victus is interesting because it shows the power of Orpheus's abilities. Victus in line 11. So the stone which is thrown at him is conquered by the sweet sound of his song and falls asking for forgiveness. So he is still protected by his art. It takes the total drowning out of his sound in order for them to be able to attack Orpheus. So you'll notice down there, non ex auditi, the stones only grow red with Orpheus's blood when they cannot hear his sound. The martial and natural imagery continues as Orpheus's song leads to the victims being the birds that are around him, the snakes and the different beasts, which form his triumphal train. Triumphal train being, of course, the very Roman celebration of military victory. And this shows you nature and war. The Maenads continue to attack, and here there's an interesting part where nature turns into something unnatural. So floats like birds in the light, and then it turns into a gladiator game. In the same way, something that's natural is turned into something that wasn't for the purpose when they use their wands with green vines to attack him with, and these wands are not made for this purpose, as mentioned with non haec munere factos. Aside from the horror of the peasants in this bit, so the women turn up and they're only able to really fully attack because they seize the tools from peasants in the area and they just scare them off. Aside from the horror of these complete mad women, this can also be read with a political lens. Madness leaving the fields deserted sounds quite a lot like what happened with the famine after land confiscations during the civil wars. And of course, it's a very Roman idea to idolize the natural world, as Virgil famously does in the Eclogues and Georgics. Orpheus, again, when they catch up with him, doesn't attack them, but tries singing again. And here, words for the first time fails him. And these women are able to fully kill him. At this point, he dies, and his soul departs. But Ovid continues here from Virgil and has a mini episode where he has a kind of afterlife, so to speak. He is mourned for by all of nature, reinforcing his natural imagery and his connection with nature. And in line 50, when his head reaches the river, there is a sense of separation again, which emphasizes dismemberment, with membra and caput being far apart. So he sings in the water and the banks reply, similar to the ending of Virgil. As he goes on, his head makes it all the way to Lesbos, and we get the final transformation in the Book of Transformations, as a snake tries to bite Orpheus's head, but Phoebus at last turns up and turns the snake into stone. There is a final part, which is another really lovely part of the Metamorphosis, as Orpheus's shade goes into the underworld and finds Eurydice again. And I think this is arguably one of the more romantic parts of Metamorphosis. Grammatically, there's this lovely part in line 66, which is the inversion. So Orpheus being the nominative, respicit, looks back at Eurydice, but Eurydice comes first, which again puts the Eurydice ahead of Orpheus and shows you grammatically how they are now able to finally have a more reciprocal nature as they're together. And tuto is a very nice adverb which emphasizes that they can now look at each other in total safety. So having looked at both of these retellings, there are a couple things that come to mind. While the plot beats are roughly the same, the heart of the story remains the same, but both poets can take a rather different spin on it. Virgil tends to criticize Orpheus for his furor, his madness in trying to find his wife, whereas Ovid seems to be a lot more sympathetic, chalking it up to more of the evils of death taking people away from you. Ovid suggests, interestingly, that there are even more versions of this myth that he himself drew from. And I think this leads me to something I said at the beginning, which is myths are not canon. We aren't exactly reading DC or Marvel comics. Myths are fluid and speak to different times, as both Virgil and Ovid have slight political leanings to them in what we've read so far. And as always, myths are just how these stories, myths show how stories are powerful and change with time. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. If you're interested in reading more, obviously read the rest of the Georgics, read the Eclogues, and definitely read the Aeneid. And I would also recommend reading the rest of Metamorphoses and Heroides if you'd like to, if you liked Ovid's tellings of the myths. I referenced the Classical Library for the translations and for the Latin itself. And I looked at these two articles, which you can find on JSTOR. If you're interested in seeing like what I'm up to with translations, I'm active on Twitter and Instagram. If you have any questions, please email. And I have this website where I put some of my translations and some other of my grammar resources on there. And thank you so much. If you have any questions, please do ask.
Thank you, Hilary. Just going to look in the chat. Yes, it is I also agree. It's enjoyable to go back and revisit them with different insights in our heads. Any questions? Anybody would like to? That was lovely. Yeah, yes, it was. Any questions or thoughts about the translations that Hilary shared or the points that she made? Yeah. Yes, Sarah.
Here we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I am sorry for the delay, first of all, but there was a misunderstanding. And then there was an earthquake just 5 minutes before I was really crazy. And then I had to leave also the conference because many people are calling me from my... Anyway, so many things happen between the 4 o'clock and 6 when the conference, maybe for Orpheus myth, it's too strong that also the earth has been up, down. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you to Hilary because it's always very, very nice. I think we saw her also last year. And she's always very sweet, very delicate. Really, when she touches the lines of ancient poets with a, I don't know, very sensible touch and by her soul. And I like very much. But if I have to choose between Ovid, that is my favorite Latin poet, and Virgil, who I love very much, I would rather say that I prefer the way Virgil tells this myth, that I agree with Hilary. Of course, myths are just a concept, so they can be read and understood by many points of view. So this myth talks about, of course, love, and as always in the Metamorphoses, the pathos. When someone does love too much, something happens, and we don't control. We don't have the metron, the modus. So, but Virgil says something very nice that I think Hilary read, but maybe I was missing that moment. When he says, cum subita incautum dementia cepita mantem, ignoscenda quidem scirent si ignoscere manes, that Orfeo was taken by a craziness, sudden, and Virgilio says that, okay, but we have to forgive him, but maybe goddesses are not, they don't know how to forgive. So this means that Virgil say, let's forgive him, that many times women, we forgive men because maybe we know that they make a lot of mistakes. That I don't want to say they are inferior, but no, they are not inferior, but it's the story. It's okay. Anyway, I see when I explain this part to my students, it's very nice because they are half male, half female, or something else, but it's always something to say. But of course, I like very much your presentation of also of the 10th book of Metamorphoses. Thank you, so Hilary.
Thank you so much for listening. I've always loved Virgil, so it was just more of seeing how I could shoehorn him into another presentation. And it was reading, I really loved that his version of Orpheus and Eurydice, and that got me thinking about how other ancient poets presented the same myth, which is why I included Ovid as well in this presentation.
Oh, and there's a question, I think, right? Is Ovid's translation the main source for this myth?
So a lot of more modern sources, when they're drawing on the myths, like to look at Ovid. So that's how quite a lot of inaccuracies come down in relation to like Greek sources. So a lot of people prefer Ovid, but for some reason, I've noticed that scholars vastly prefer Virgil, because they were really harsh in the articles I was reading about Ovid's telling of Orpheus. And personally, I will always prefer Virgil, but I do really love Ovid. Recently, at a lecture here, there was a lecturer ended up asking all of us if we could sacrifice one work in order to take a lost work back, what would you do? Someone suggested getting rid of Ovid and received the most intense round of boos I've ever heard in the room.
Wow.
That's quite funny. Oh. So yeah, a question that comes to me as I think about that is, why are we in modern times, why are we drawn to some versions of the myths over others? So it's fun to think about in the future, what will people say about our retellings? And when they maybe compare them and look at retellings from the mid 20th century to the early 21st century, what differences will they find and how will they interact? We probably can't answer that, but it's fun to think about for the future. Although you might have a provisional answer.
As a challenge, I was wondering about what makes a myth stick. And I think it fundamentally boils down to, can a story in its very, very essence speak to you in some way? Because I think the reason why Orpheus and Eurydice has such a lasting power is because it can be very simply put, how far will you go for love? And I think that's what makes or breaks a myth retelling. It's just, do you get to the essence of the story, and do you tell it in a compelling way?
Yeah.
And absolutely, people do not change. I was reading in a lecture, there was a reference to Velius Paterculus, and I was curious about what was going on in there. And this guy, put simply, is such a fanboy for Cicero that I was just fascinated by the guy. Just hero worship doesn't change either.
That's true too. Very true. Do you have a favorite? That's an interesting question. What are some favorite modern retellings of Orpheus and Eurydice, whether in writing or any other art form?
I like Hades Town a lot. And the Sandman comics, I liked their telling of Orpheus because his story becomes really central to the undoing of the main character Morpheus' dream. And while it's very much not a faithful retelling of the myth, I liked the world that it built. Not going to say that much more in case of spoilers, but the comics are worth reading if you've got the time.
Anyone else? Any other favorites?
Any other favorites? I'm not too sure. I don't object to the operas, but I would definitely prefer a slightly more modern music taste.
Have you read Zachary Zane's Metamorphoses?
Zachary's thing? I don't think I have.
Is it Zachary? No, it's not Zachary Zane, is it? Help me out. He wrote the Lost Books of the Odyssey.
Oh, Mason, I believe. Zachary
That's
Mason.
it, Zachary Mason. Don't know where I got Zane from.
I found it. I'll have to read this soon. Thank you.
I thought you might like it.
Thank you. I look forward to reading this so much. Oh, this looks cool.
Yeah, I feel like I need to reread. Now I'm thinking, oh, I need to reread the Lost Books of the Odyssey too.
Everyone needs to reread the Lost Books of the Odyssey. Yeah, Lost Books of the Odyssey and Metamorphosis. Yeah, so
Adding
This
that
is
one.
pretty exciting.
interested in if you had read them, what you thought of, especially the Metamorphosis as opposed to the Ovid, so to speak. But you haven't, so that's fine. Go away and read them.
Absolutely. I know what I'm going to do tomorrow.
Right. And somebody's saying a three-way comparison. That's also really interesting, right? We could be looking at retellings in different mediums. What do the different mediums allow us to do and not allow us to do? We could look at retellings across the modern period and see how each one reflects its culture.
Especially like with Myths of Medea, because that's had such a long history of adaptations. Consider all the operas, which seem ancient to me, and all the different modern retellings, which seem like a dime a dozen at the moment inside bookstores. It'd be really cool to see like that change.
Agreed. And here, do you have a myth you'd like to see a modern retelling of that doesn't already exist? Great question.
That's a difficult one. Well, I'm actually working with here at Durham. There's a project going on at the moment that is doing a theatrical retelling of the story of Dido, and I'm really excited as to how it's coming together at the moment. And that made me consider the character in a way I hadn't before. So that's a retelling that's very cool. Doesn't quite exist yet, but will in about a month.
And then there's, have you thought of writing a version yourself, Hillary?
While doing this presentation, I ended up on a call with Marie, and we ended up chatting about what adaptations we could consider, because I ended up with very frustrated. I know why people adapt Orpheus and Eurydice, because you can boil it down to that one simple concept. Are there any other myths that have that one simple concept that can be retold easily? So we end up having a really long conversation over that, and several ideas, still working on it.
If you're interested, there is, I was showing it the other day, a series of, I think it's 4 adverts. I think it's Givenchy, one of the Italian, and they do the whole story of Orpheus and Eurydice, set in modern. It looks like New York to me. Could be wrong. Showcasing their fashions. It's one of the big fashion houses. I think it's available on YouTube. It's an interesting take because it tells the whole story in just these 4 2-minute adverts. If I can, when I can track it down, I will send it to you and Irene to have a look at when I can remember which fashion house it was. Someone like Givenchy, Italian, so it might have been Gucci.
Also, another myth that could do with a retelling is Camilla from the Aeneid, because I've always been really struck by her, and I absolutely love the parts where she's featured. And I think you could do a very good retelling of her, because her friendship with Turnus is by no means romantic, and I feel like there is a dearth of good platonic friendships in like modern storytelling. So I think that could do with a very good retelling.
You
Maybe
really
something to
took
consider.
that right out of my head. I was thinking Camilla because I'm always so dissatisfied with her death. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't read the Aeneid, but yeah. So I would. That's what I do. What's that?
Suddenly thinking, trying to find that passage.
Little Red Lobe.
I have plenty of little red books here.
I think I should have liberated them from school when I had the chance.
There's always time. It's just a question of when.
Right. So yeah, here's a question also for everyone who's here is which different versions of the ancient sources would you like to see in a presentation? Like which comparisons? Because I'm trying to corral Hillary to do a Greek Roman head to head.
We'll be doing unadapted Greek next term, so I might be able to attempt translation.
Well, Hillary and I had some conversations about the 2 different versions of Medea. Yes, Marie, right?
Yeah.
It's Greek Roman.
That would be so cool. I recently did a really long translation of Seneca's Medea because I've loved the bit where she completely loses control and goes, the source of everything, the reason why I call on you so often, Hecate, is one person, Jason. And like I absolutely love that part, so I ended up doing a big translation on it. So I'd be really interested to look at Euripides too.
That would be cool.
Any other suggestions? What could we? Trojan women? Ooh, that's a good one too. Yes.
Trojan women would be interesting.
Yeah. Creation myths.
Seneca, yes, he did, if I remember correctly. He did.
He comes from the prehistory. Oh, funny. Oh, that's interesting. The comedies. Oh, that would be interesting. Antigone?
Antigone would be cool. Terence, I have read some of his. I mean, I did read him not that long ago, and I like it. It would be a bit difficult to compare him to Aristophanes, though, because the sense of humor is quite different. So Cicero really liked Terence because he said that his work is very light and pleasant. It's not as laugh out loud funny in the same way as Aristophanes, in my opinion. Marie is right. Operas are ancient.
Those are ancient. That's funny. I have to admit, I do Hippolytus and Phaedra. I have to admit that Antigone really, maybe because I love the Greek Antigone so much, that would be really interesting. I mean, these are all wonderful. Thank you so much. These are all really fantastic suggestions.
These are really exciting ideas.
Yeah. I feel like we have a program for the next few years. Many possibilities. The clouds, right.
Oh, my favorite one of Aristophanes' plays. It's The Clouds. I'm currently in a production of The Frogs, but I always will prefer The Clouds.
Wow.
That's a tough one because I do love the frogs a lot.
I love The Frogs, I really do, but The Clouds, first one I read and the one I love the most.
Wow.
It is really good. It is, Clouds is really excellent. Our Tide, yeah. Is there a novel about that staging of Antigone? That's a question for Andy in the chat.
Yeah, I just have in my head that there was a novel about that, or was it a play within a play? I can't quite remember. About Antigone being performed. That's it. The Island. That's it.
Yeah, it was a play within a play. It was the prisoners of Robben Island who enacted Antigone, but it was actually so close to what they were going through themselves, which is why they chose it.
The Island. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Any other thoughts or questions? This has just been A100 at the OU. Now this has been a really interesting discussion, and I thank you so much, everyone, for these wonderful suggestions and contributions.
Just in the back of my mind, sorry, about Antigone, that it was also a version was performed in occupied France, and in front of the Germans, and Antigone saying no was supposed to be the French replying to German occupation.
But I read it years ago, but I haven't read it recently. Very interesting. Oh, okay. So you guys are talking.
Plautus is fun.
Oh, you're muted, Sarah.
Okay. The Amphitryon, because my students are writing very interesting comments about it, the problem of the identity, transgender, and so on. It's very nice. I mean, who are you? If you are me, who am I? And from this point onward, we are trying to make something contemporary. But I don't know where does it end, but we are working on it. And also Amphitryon, it's very interesting about the modernized something.
Yeah, and it really is amazing when you think how even things that we think are new are not new. They're really very ancient. So there's something kind of comforting, I think, about that. You can either look at it as very distressing, right? Because nothing ever changes, or some kind of comfort in the eternally human.
Why not both? Why not both?
Right? Absolutely both. Yeah. Yeah. Both and, as the Greeks loved. Right. Well, if there are no more questions, I just will say thank you so very much to Hilary for being here and sharing your work, and for this wonderful discussion, everyone who was here. And yes, I hope to see you next week. We are doing, it's going to be wonderful. We're going to be looking at the Scholia for Argonautica. So we'll get to dive into a period we haven't looked at so far this season, with some Hellenistic work. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilary. I
Thank
hope you
you,
get
everyone.
on okay at Durham.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.